Hello everyone, welcome to this week's episode, and this one is a bit different. Today I'm going to be looking at some Canon R5 RAW files, and a few months ago in the autumn I took the Canon R5 after hiring it for one day to a nature reserve, and I coupled it with this 400mm unstabilized L prime lens 5.6, and I wanted to test how the IBIS of the R5 worked with the unstabilized lens. And as an afterthought, I also did some tests to see what the dynamic range of the... Oops, I just kicked the camera. And as an extra test, I did some shots to test the dynamic range of the R5 as well. Unfortunately, my 10-year-old MacBook Pro wasn't up to the task of editing those CR3 files, so I didn't get a chance to see what the dynamic range of the R5 was like. In November, I managed to sell a photo on my stock agency for $600, and that helped me save towards buying a new computer. And I now have the MacBook Air M1, and I can update the operating system of that to Big Sur, and that just allows me to edit the CR3 files of the new Canon R5. So that's what I'm going to do today. And I'll just click on the record button of the QuickTime screen recording and just hope that it works. Here we go. Okay, we've got that running. I've only had this M1 for about a week, and I've only been using this version of Lightroom CC for about 2 days, so I'm really scratchy and not really familiar with it. So just bear with me. And I only had the R5 for 1 day, so I wasn't that experienced with that either. But having said those caveats, let's get into some files. Okay, so the first one we have is of a bird of prey and a kestrel, and you can tell that it's under, well, not underexposed, but it's in shadow because it's backlit. The sun is behind it, producing this kind of rim light on the wings and the head, and the underbelly and wings are in shadow. So let's see how much we can bump the shadows up on this and get some detail on its wings. I'm at plus 57, and that looks pretty good. I'm zoomed in at 100%, and that looks pretty nice. I'll just zoom in at 300%, and I think I've previously added noise reduction on this, so see what it looks like without noise reduction. It's not too bad. It was taken at ISO 400 at F6.3 at 1 2500th of a second. So yeah, this version of Lightroom CC is very different to the older version that I was using, Lightroom 5. I regret making the decision to get CC. I should have gone for the Lightroom Classic, which was very similar to Lightroom 5, but with a lot of updated features, of course. So I'm still getting used to this CC version. So at ISO 400 it's pretty clean. I'll just bump it up to about 20 and see how that looks at 100% now. And it's not too bad. So for that backlit kestrel, we bumped the shadows up to plus 57, so I think that's a success for that one. Even though the bird's not totally sharp, That's nothing to do with dynamic range, it's more probably to do with the camera operator. Let's have a look at another one. Oh, this one's really in shadow. So let's bump the shadows up again. And all the way almost. That looks pretty good. Go into 200%. It's not totally sharp. Don't want to put too much sharpening on it because then it looks a little bit artificial. I'll drop it back down to about 35. And see how it looks at 100%. Yeah, that's quite successful as well, bringing back the shadow on that bird. Okay, let's try a different kind of bird now. And this is a fieldfare, which is a migratory bird that comes from Scandinavia or Russia and passes through the Netherlands in around October, November. That's not too overexposed. Let's try another one. Here we go. This bit under the wing looks a little bit blown out, so we can maybe do something with the highlights on that. Here we are on the slider. That looks pretty good. I'm all the way down to -97 now, and it hasn't really degraded the image at all. Just the feathers around here are affected, but that's pretty good. Tried at 200% and can see feather detail, so I'm pretty happy with that. Yeah, not too bad. And let's try some more. Okay, it looks like we've got some, maybe, yeah, starlings. Heavily backlit now. So I'm not sure how much I can do with this. It'll be good exercise anyway. That's +78. And that's shadows all the way up. And if I bring up the exposure, yeah, exposure is a waste of time. But that recovers a significant amount of that starling, even though the image is really not savable. It's too fuzzy and unsharp, and I'm not sure whether that's because it's out of focus. I think it's more because it's so heavily backlit. So yeah, I would say that's not such a success. It was extremely backlit. We'll go back to the start. It's just basically a shadow. I see here there's some blur on the feathers, and at 1600th of a second, maybe it wasn't a fast enough shutter speed. It's only ISO 160. Inconclusive on that one. Let's go to a Magpie. Now this is a reasonably well exposed image. The only thing is you've got this huge contrast between white feathers and black feathers, and the image is not in focus either. But it'll be a good exercise to see how the highlights can be controlled around these feathers and the shadows on the dark feathers. So we'll go with the highlights first. Ooh, that's not looking too good. I've lost detail around here and here, and that's all the way down -91. I think the image was too overexposed to start with, but what's the stats on it? ISO 640, 6.3 at 1600th of a second. Yeah, Well, the highlights weren't really a success on that one. Let's see what the shadows are like. Plus 40 on the slider, plus 65. Well, on this one, the shadows are more of a success. There's some noise detail for sure. But at 200%, oh, it's at 200% already. Now, I would say that's a success. If it was in focus, it would have been more of a success, but managed to get back some feather detail there. Although, to be honest, at 200%, or what am I at? Oh, 319%. Let's see what it looks like at 100%. Yeah, you've got some detail in the feathers. This is what it was like originally, and this is what it was like after I bumped up the shadows. So that's not too bad. Okay, let's have a look at an underexposed duck now. This is what it looks like to start with. Oh, I've got the exposure bumped up there. This is what it looked like when I captured the image. And that was 1,000th of a second at ISO 1000 at F5.6. And now I'm going to raise the exposure. If I just raise the shadows, I don't think it'll have any effect, and no, it doesn't. So we'll go with the exposure plus 1.4. I guess that's 1.5 stops, plus 2 stops, plus 3, and 100%. That's not too bad, except for a green tinge. I think I've previously bumped up the noise reduction. That's 100%, I guess. Yep. So a bit of noise reduction. Maybe I can change that green hue, because that's what it was like originally with full exposure at plus 3 stops, plus 3.47. It's very green. It's affected the color. Yeah, so I'm not too thrilled with that. I think I'd have to work with the white balance. Let's have a look here. So it's a bit green. I can see what the... No. Well, I can do a little bit. It brings it back a touch, but then it gives it kind of this grey blue feel. I would say that was too much to ask of the R5. From this to that, maybe 2 stops. That's it at 2 stops. Still got a bit of a greeny hue, but it's salvageable. Yeah, I'm 50-50 on that one. Okay, now let's go to mute Swan. And this mute Swan was taken at 6400 ISO at f8 at 1/1250th of a second. And focus was on the eye, and it looks pretty sharp there. At 300%, doesn't look too bad. 200 and 100. So that looks pretty good. You've got some nice feather detail here. It's well exposed. And you've got some water droplets as well, so it looks sharp. But that's not the end of the story. Over here, it's blown out. So we've exposed pretty much for the shadows on this and for the neck where it was focused on. But as is the nature of photographing white birds, you run the risk of losing detail in the white feathers. So let's see if we can bring that back. So I can't do anything with the exposure because that'll just make it even more underexposed. I can bring the highlights down. So here we go. Down to -42. And I've brought the highlights all the way down. And even though the feathers are out of focus, because the focus was on the neck and the head, I've got some good detail there in the feathers. So I would call that a success. So today, on my limited experience with Lightroom, I've managed to pull back the highlights on the R5 CR3 files on that field fare that was flying, and the Swan. Really, I think if the image is exposed correctly, then you can pull back the highlights to maybe 3 stops. I'm not sure exactly how many stops this slider represents, but all the way down to the bottom of the slider, and we've got some good detail in those feathers. The Magpie, I think, was overexposed to start with, so if you do that, chances are you're going to lose your highlights with this camera. Although I only had 1 day experience with it, and I've only had 2 days experience with this Lightroom CC. But that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the R5 is capable of with manipulating its RAW files. I'm sure if you have more experience with software, you'll be able to get more out of the files. But I hope that was interesting to you guys, and if it was, feel free to give this video a like. And if you want to support my channel, feel free to buy me a decaf cappuccino. The link is in the description. Anyway, I hope you have a great day further, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!